Have you ever stopped to think about what's really happening behind the scenes of the alliance between China and Russia? While the Western world watches with concern, Beijing and Moscow are forming a partnership that could reshape global geopolitics. Since the war in Ukraine, China has become a strategic pillar for Russia, providing crucial economic and technological support. But is this union as solid as it seems? In this video, we'll unveil the secrets behind this alliance, the historical mistrust, the hidden tensions, and how Russia's growing dependence on China might shift the global balance of power. If you want to understand how this relationship could impact your future and global developments, stay with us until the end. Furthermore, to stay well-informed with specialized geopolitical content and about the global conflicts happening right now, you need a trustworthy channel, and this is the one. So, subscribe now to receive all the content you need to stay up to date. Now let's dive in. Beijing has been placed in an uncomfortable position regarding one of its largest trade partners, the European Union, due to Russia's war. Some Western strategists seem to hope that Sino-Russian discontent will lead to a division similar to the famous Sino-Soviet split of the 1960s and early 1970s. Therefore, it is useful to evaluate the strength of the current Beijing-Moscow axis by comparing it to the Sino-Soviet alliance of the Cold War, and that's the objective of today's video. Looking back at history, on October 2, 2024, it marked 75 years since the Soviet Union became the first country to recognize the newly founded People's Republic of China and establish diplomatic relations with the new regime. In December 1949, China's supreme leader, Mao Zedong, traveled to Moscow for his first official overseas visit. The two-month visit culminated with Mao signing a friendship treaty with his Soviet counterpart Stalin. However, this near alliance lasted only about a decade because, in 1961, authorities in Beijing denounced Soviet communism as the work of traitors, and a border war between the countries broke out in 1969. Later, in 1971, China took an even more confrontational approach with the Soviet Union, shifting sides and aligning with the United States. But this history shouldn't inspire hope for a similar collapse in Sino-Russian ties. A shift in alignment seems far less likely today. When Russian dictator Vladimir Putin boasted in March 2024 that Russia's relationship with China was at its best, he wasn't just bragging. It's a significant truth. When comparing current Sino-Russian ties with the Sino-Soviet alignment of the past across 5 critical factors: geopolitics, economics, ideology, leadership, and institutions, it becomes clear that the Beijing-Moscow axis is stronger today than it ever was. First, the Beijing-Moscow axis now exists in a more favorable geopolitical context. Just as in the early Cold War, their antagonistic relationship with the United States has brought them closer together. However, today, they have less to fear from each other than during the Cold War. The strength and global reach of Soviet military power made it a potential threat to Beijing's security throughout the Cold War. Today, China is the more powerful partner, but its limited geographical reach makes it a smaller threat to Russia. In other words, while Russia can no longer pose the same level of threat as the Soviet Union once did, China, despite being stronger today, cannot threaten Russia to the same extent. Furthermore, Moscow knows that China is preoccupied in the near future with its naval rivalry with the United States, which reduces Beijing's willingness and capacity to threaten Russia and its neighborhood with terrestrial expansion. Secondly, while Soviet economic and technical assistance dominated the Sino-Soviet friendship phase, Beijing and Moscow have formed, over the past decade, an economic relationship based on the complementary nature of their economies. Russia is now China's largest source of crude oil and its second largest source of natural gas, while China is Russia's largest source of imported technology. Beijing and Moscow have also agreed on expanded cooperation in sectors such as satellite navigation, space, and atomic energy. There's no denying that Western sanctions on Russia are an obstacle to the trade relationship between the two, but China and Russia are trying to circumvent these sanctions in the financial sector by adopting a barter-based transaction system to facilitate trade between the two powers. Third point, ideology was a much more significant factor during the Cold War. A shared belief in communism supported the Sino-Soviet alliance, just as ideological differences then contributed to its rupture, with Mao strongly criticizing the post-Stalin reforms of Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Today, ideology is simply a much less intense factor in global politics. Nonetheless, it helps unite China and Russia, with both authoritarian regimes concerned about the ability of Western ideas to undermine their political stability. However, it is hard to imagine that ideological differences today could lead to a rupture in their relations. Fourth point, leadership. It has always been essential in foreign policy, and the dialogue between the top leadership in Beijing and Moscow is much stronger today than it was during the Cold War. There was never much trust between Mao and his Soviet counterparts, Stalin and Khrushchev, for example. Mao was irritated by Stalin's demands during the Friendship Treaty negotiations and intentionally humiliated Khrushchev during the Soviet leader's visit to China in 1958. The contrast with today was highlighted in 2018 when Putin became the first foreign recipient of China's Friendship Medal. We probably shouldn't take too seriously the fact that Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping continually refer to each other as close friends. More important than that is the fact that the two have met more than 40 times since 2012, when she became General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. Fifth point, institutional ties between China and Russia are broader and deeper today than they were during the Cold War. When China and the Soviet Union signed the Friendship Treaty in 1950, their respective communist parties already had close ties dating back to the early 1920s. However, these ties were not free of friction, and beyond them, the scope of collaboration was limited to Soviet specialists sent to China in the 1950s to assist with its industrialization. In contrast, although the current Sino-Russian relationship is still largely top-down, it has strong ties across a wide range of government agencies. At the highest political level, China and Russia have established regular meetings between their leaders. Additionally, they have held 18 rounds of high-level strategic security consultations, the most recent in Moscow in 2023, and manage several other intergovernmental commissions and working groups between the two governments. Military ties between the two countries are now undoubtedly stronger than ever. Since China and Russia first participated in a joint military exercise in 2003, they have conducted over 100 joint military exercises involving land, air, naval, cyber, and paramilitary forces. This level of joint activity across their various services helps to cement these ties. Beyond all this, the current Sino-Russian relationship is not entirely top-down. It also includes expanded interpersonal relations, such as local initiatives, academic collaboration, student exchanges, and tourism. These connections have developed uninterruptedly for over 3 decades since the end of the Cold War in 1991. While institutional and interpersonal ties alone are not drivers of alignment, they demonstrate the stability of a bilateral relationship. Given that the United States managed to play the China card against the Soviet Union in the 1970s, it is tempting to explore the possibilities of weakening the current Sino-Russian alliance. However, the relatively strong foundation for cooperation between China and Russia, as discussed in this video, reduces the likelihood of a major rupture similar to what happened during the Cold War. It makes sense for the United States and Europe to pressure China to reduce its support for Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. But any attempt to distance China from Russia more broadly is likely to fail because Beijing's policy toward Russia is driven, above all, by its superpower rivalry with the United States and the West. It would be like trying to pull the Soviet Union away from China during the Cold War, which would make no sense. Perhaps a divide-and-conquer strategy would have a better chance of success if it targeted the weaker member of the partnership. During the Cold War, that member was China. Today, it is Russia. However, despite Western sanctions, Russia is in a stronger position now than China was in the early 1970s when Mao decided to align with Washington. At that time, China was economically isolated following its split with Moscow in the early 1960s and had recently fought a border war with the Soviet Union. In other words, the incentive for China to strike a deal with Washington back then was high, and the cost for the Americans was low. Today, however, Russia is much more aligned with China and benefits greatly from its strong support. If Washington tried to pull Moscow away from Beijing, the Russian leadership would demand a very high price, likely imposing significant costs on European security. But even an attractive deal allowing Russia to improve its position in Europe might not be enough to distance it from China. Why would Russia abandon its strong relationship with China if it does not see Beijing as a serious threat to its security? Moscow knows that Beijing is preoccupied with Washington. A total Russian defeat in Ukraine and the potential collapse of its economy might change the Russian leadership's calculations, perhaps. But China is likely far more willing than the United States or Europe to help Russia rebuild its economic and military power. The United States only managed to play the China card against the Soviet Union during the Cold War because of the Sino-Soviet split that occurred a decade earlier, with China perceiving Russia as a considerable threat to its security. In other words, the Sino-Soviet alliance unraveled on its own, internally, not because the United States applied external pressure or offered an irresistible deal. Although the Sino-Russian relationship will likely never be perfectly stable, it is hard to imagine something akin to the Sino-Soviet collapse threatening their alliance. In sharp contrast to the Cold War, the current Beijing-Moscow axis rests on a solid geopolitical foundation, with strong economic ties, a lack of ideological friction, close relations between the leaders of both countries, and a well-established web of bilateral and institutional links. The new axis of dictatorships is here to stay. And that's today's video. If you found the information I shared here helpful, subscribe now, as I'll be producing weekly content, and only by subscribing will you receive it. Also, don't forget to leave a like so that others who need to learn more about this topic can have the chance to watch and stay aware of global changes. See you in the next video.